In the smouldering ashes of the Second World War, a promise was forged. From the ruins of a continent ravaged by two global conflicts, an alliance was born with a single solemn vow: never again. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was sold to the world as the ultimate shield, a guarantor of peace through collective strength.
The alliance is there now for 75 years, and we went from 12 to now almost 32.
For over 75 years, it's been praised as the most successful military alliance in history, a bastion of democracy that kept the peace in Europe. What if the very thing designed to prevent war is now, by its own actions, paving the road for the next one? This is the story of how an alliance for peace started waging wars of choice. It's an investigation into a crucial conversation about NATO not expanding 1 inch eastward, and how the debate over that promise has reshaped our world. From the skies over Belgrade to the shores of Libya, and in its relentless march towards its old adversary, a different picture of NATO emerges. To understand NATO, you have to go back to the world that made it. The year is 1949. Europe is a continent of ghosts, haunted by war and shivering in the shadow of a new threat. The Iron Curtain has fallen, and Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union casts a pall of fear over the West. The Red Army didn't go home after beating the Nazis, it stayed, propping up communist regimes across Eastern Europe in what looked like a staging ground for a future invasion. It was in this climate of fear that 12 nations signed the Washington Treaty, creating NATO. On paper, its purpose was simple, elegant, and purely defensive. The heart of the treaty is Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. It was a clear message to Moscow. An attack on West Berlin, Paris, or Oslo would be met with the full force of the alliance, including America's nuclear arsenal. It was the ultimate deterrent, designed to make the cost of aggression impossibly high. But underneath the public mission, a deeper game was being played. NATO's very first Secretary General, Lord Hastings Ismay, famously quipped that the alliance's real purpose was threefold: to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Let's break that down, because it says more than decades of official press releases. Keep the Soviet Union out was the obvious part, the mission everyone agreed on. Keep the Americans in was just as vital. After America joined the two world wars late, European leaders were terrified of a return to American isolationism. They needed a permanent American commitment to their security. NATO formalized America's role as the continent's protector, embedding US troops, command structures, and its nuclear umbrella permanently in Europe. And then, the most revealing part: keep the Germans down. Germany had been at the center of the two most destructive wars in human history. Rearming West Germany was seen as necessary to defend against the Soviets. The idea of an independent German army terrified its neighbors. NATO was the solution. By integrating West Germany into the alliance in 1955, it could be rearmed, but its forces would be contained within a framework led by the United States. Its power could be used for the West without ever again threatening the West. So, from the very beginning, NATO was more than just a defensive pact. It was a tool for projecting American power, managing old European rivalries, and ensuring the ideological alignment of its members. With NATO established, the lines were drawn. The Soviet Union answered in 1955 by forming its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. The world was now split into two nuclear-armed camps, locked in a permanent, high-stakes stare-down. This era is often called the Long Peace, because a direct, hot war between the superpowers was avoided. But calling it peace doesn't feel right. It was a peace held hostage by the threat of total annihilation. The core of this dangerous peace was nuclear deterrence. At first, NATO's policy was called massive retaliation. It was stark. Any Soviet aggression, even a conventional one, could be met with a full-scale American nuclear attack. This strategy turned any skirmish in Europe into a potential civilization-ending event. Later, this softened into flexible response, which offered a range of options before going nuclear. But the reality was the same. The defense of Europe was tied to the willingness to use nuclear weapons. This era was marked by moments that brought the world to the brink. The Berlin crises saw Soviet and American tanks facing off at Checkpoint Charlie. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis was the ultimate expression of this standoff, a 13-day nightmare where the world held its breath. These weren't just theories, they were moments when the system almost failed. The alliance wasn't always a happy family either. In 1966, France's Charles de Gaulle, frustrated with American dominance, withdrew France from NATO's integrated military command. He wasn't rejecting the alliance, but he refused to let France's destiny be decided in Washington. It was a powerful reminder that NATO was made of individual nations, not just pawns in a superpower chess game. So, was the Cold War a success for NATO? On the one hand, yes, it prevented a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. There was no World War III. But this peace was built on terror. It locked the world into a bipolar order defined by military confrontation and the constant nagging threat of apocalypse. This was the mindset the alliance carried forward when, in 1989, the world it was built to fight suddenly began to disappear. History isn't just the past, it's the blueprint for what's happening today. If you are finding this eye-opening, give the video a like and subscribe to join us as we uncover the hidden forces shaping our world. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Cold War was ending. The Warsaw Pact, NATO's adversary, crumbled and then officially dissolved. Suddenly, NATO's entire reason for being seemed to have evaporated. The enemy was gone. But NATO's defensive mandate technically remained. Now, this was a historic opportunity to build a new, inclusive European security plan, one that might even include a newly democratic Russia. In this uncertain atmosphere, one of the most contentious episodes in modern history took place. The big question was German reunification. The Soviets still had hundreds of thousands of troops in East Germany and could veto any plan. For Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to agree, he needed assurances that a unified Germany wouldn't be a threat. He needed to know what would happen with NATO. This is where the story gets complicated. In a key meeting on February 9, 1990, US Secretary of State James Baker met with Gorbachev. According to declassified documents, Baker made a now famous assurance as part of a discussion. He stated there would be not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will spread in an eastern direction. Other Western leaders made similar statements. The message seemed clear. Let Germany unify within NATO, and we won't use it to expand to your borders. Now, was this a legally binding treaty? No, it was never written in a formal document, a point defenders of NATO expansion have stressed ever since. But international relations are built on trust as much as on treaties. The records show these assurances were offered to get the Soviets to agree to German reunification. Gorbachev accepted them and, in a move of historic consequence, didn't block it. For a moment, a new era seemed possible, but the promise didn't hold. The logic of expansion took over in Washington. By the mid-1990s, proponents argued that the free nations of Eastern Europe had a right to choose their own alliances. Russia, a shadow of its former self, protested that this violated the spirit of the 1990 agreements, but Russia was weak, and its objections were brushed aside. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. To the West, it was a triumph for freedom. To Moscow, it was a betrayal. It was the first step in what they saw as the steady march of a hostile military alliance right to their doorstep. The breaking of the foundational understanding that had ended the Cold War. This single act, more than any other, set the stage for decades of confrontation. Supporters argue NATO's eastward expansion was essential for creating a lasting security order in post-communist Europe, an acknowledgement of national self-determination, and a hedge against future instability. As the 90s closed, NATO wasn't just expanding, it was transforming. The alliance that spent 40 years as a defensive shield was about to go to war for the first time. In doing so, it would cross a line, setting a precedent for the 21st century. The stage for this transformation was the former Yugoslavia. By 1990, the world was watching in horror as Serbian forces under Slobodan Milosevic waged a campaign of brutal ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. After peace talks failed, NATO decided to act. On March 24, 1999, NATO began Operation Allied Force, a 78-day bombing campaign against Yugoslavia. The stated goal was humanitarian, to stop the violence, but the act itself was revolutionary. For the first time, NATO launched a major bombing campaign against a sovereign nation. Critically, it did so without the approval of the United Nations Security Council. This was a huge deal. Russia and China were strongly opposed to the intervention and held veto power at the UN. Instead of being stopped, NATO simply bypassed the UN, arguing that a moral duty to stop a catastrophe triumphed international law. The alliance was effectively declaring that it could decide when and where to use force, with or without a global mandate. The air campaign was massive. It achieved its goal. Serbian forces withdrew, but it came at a cost. While NATO tried to avoid civilian casualties, mistakes were made. Bombs hit a passenger train, a refugee convoy, and most controversially, the headquarters of Radio Television of Serbia, killing 16 civilian media workers. The Chinese embassy in Belgrade was also hit, killing 3. Human Rights Watch estimates that between 489 and 528 civilians were killed in this campaign. The war in Yugoslavia was a watershed moment. It transformed NATO from a defensive pact into an interventionist power willing to use offensive force for political goals, far from its borders. By bypassing the UN, it weakened the very legal order it claimed to protect. And by attacking a traditional ally of Russia, it deepened Moscow's feeling of alienation and encirclement. The shield had proven it could be a sword. After Yugoslavia, the logic of intervention was baked into NATO's DNA. The 21st century saw 2 more major out-of-area wars, each pushing the alliance further from its original purpose, and each ending in ways that raised hard questions about its judgment. Afghanistan started as a textbook case of collective defense. After the 9/11 attacks, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first and only time. The attack on the US was an attack on all. This led to the NATO-led mission in Afghanistan, tasked by the UN with stabilizing the country after the Taliban was ousted. But what began as a counter-terrorism mission slowly morphed into a 2-decade-long project of nation-building. NATO wasn't just providing security, it was trying to build a modern democracy from the ground up. The war dragged on for 20 years, costing trillions of dollars, thousands of Allied lives, and tens of thousands of Afghan civilian lives. In August 2021, as NATO forces withdrew, the Afghan army they had spent 2 decades training simply melted away. The Taliban swept back into power before the last plane left Kabul. The 20-year intervention ended where it began, a humiliating lesson in the limits of military power. If Afghanistan was a slow-burning failure, Libya was a case of catastrophic success. In 2011, during the Arab Spring, an uprising began against the dictator Muammar Gaddafi. As his forces closed in on the rebel-held city of Benghazi, the UN Security Council authorized a no-fly zone to protect civilians. NATO took charge of the mission. The mandate was strictly humanitarian. But it quickly became clear that key NATO members wanted regime change. NATO jets became the rebels' personal air force, systematically dismantling Gaddafi's regime. In October 2011, Gaddafi was captured and killed. The intervention was hailed as a low-cost success. But the aftermath was an unmitigated disaster. Before the intervention, Libya was an oppressive autocracy, but it was a unified state. The intervention toppled the regime, but had no plan for what came next. With Gaddafi gone, Libya collapsed into a brutal, multi-sided civil war that rages to this day. It became a failed state, a hub for terrorists and human traffickers. The mission to prevent a humanitarian crisis ended up creating a permanent one, destabilizing the entire region. The expansion that began in 1999 didn't stop. In 2004, NATO absorbed 7 more countries, including the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, nations that were once part of the Soviet Union itself. Each expansion was celebrated in the West as a victory for freedom, and viewed in Moscow as another step in a deliberate strategy of encirclement. The breaking point came at the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest. There, despite warnings from France and Germany, the alliance, pushed by the US, made a fateful declaration: Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. For Russia, this was the ultimate red line. William J. Burns, then the US ambassador to Moscow and now CIA director, sent a cable to Washington months before the summit. The subject line, "Niet," means niet. Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. He warned that Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. He predicted it would be seen as a direct challenge that could force Russia to intervene. He was ignored. Just 4 months later, Russia went to war with Georgia. In 2014, after a pro-Western revolution in Ukraine, Russia annexed Crimea and started a separatist war in the Donbass region. And on February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. From NATO's perspective, its actions are purely defensive. It argues that sovereign nations have the right to choose their own alliances to protect themselves from Russian aggression. In this view, Russia's invasion is an unprovoked act of imperialism, and supporting Ukraine is a moral imperative. From Moscow's perspective, its invasion is a desperate response to decades of provocation. Russia claims it acted defensively against a hostile alliance that broke its promises, ignored repeated warnings, and finally crossed the brightest of its red lines in Ukraine. The result is the most dangerous geopolitical crisis in decades. NATO is more unified than ever, with Finland and Sweden joining its ranks. The alliance is pouring weapons into Ukraine to ensure Russia does not win. The risk of a direct clash between NATO and Russian forces, a war between nuclear powers, is terrifyingly real. The debate over who is to blame will rage on, but the historical decisions, the disputed promise, the relentless expansion, the crossing of declared red lines are an undeniable part of the chain of events that led to the current carnage. As NATO has grown, a key question has become more urgent. Who decides? Who makes the monumental choice to go to war or to expand the alliance? This points to what critics call NATO's democratic deficit. Major interventions like Yugoslavia and Libya were launched without a single public vote in any member country. For years, NATO members have been pressured by the US to meet a target of spending at least 2% of their GDP on defense. This directs trillions of dollars toward military budgets, with the primary beneficiaries being the giant arms manufacturers. This financial commitment is part of a structure that reinforces US dominance. The Supreme Allied Commander in Europe has always been an American, and NATO's strategic focus is increasingly aligned with American interests, not just in Europe, but globally. Recent NATO strategy documents now name China as a systemic challenge, extending the focus of a North Atlantic alliance to the other side of the planet to confront America's primary competitor. This has led some to call NATO an empire by invitation. Nations aren't conquered, they choose to join. But in doing so, they agree to subordinate parts of their foreign policy to a structure dominated by the United States. They trade a piece of their sovereignty for a security guarantee. For many, it's been a worthy bargain. But it has also entangled all 32 members in a global strategy that extends far beyond the defensive mission for which the alliance was created. So, we come back to our question. Is NATO the most dangerous alliance in history? The answer is a paradox. For the citizens inside its bubble, NATO has been an incredible success. It has overseen an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity for its members. From that vantage point, it's the greatest peacekeeping alliance ever built. But there's another side to this story. The story of an alliance that, when its original enemy vanished, refused to disappear. Instead, it reinvented itself. Critics argue it became an expansionist power, breaking informal understandings and marching to the borders of a weakened Russia, sowing the seeds of a future conflict. It transformed from a defensive shield into an interventionist sword, waging war in Yugoslavia without UN approval, and leaving Libya in ruins. NATO was created to solve the problem of a potential Third World War, but today, the alliance finds itself at the very heart of a new global confrontation. The war in Ukraine, the most devastating in Europe since 1945, cannot be understood without the context of NATO expansion. The alliance is now in a tense standoff with a nuclear-armed Russia, a standoff its own actions helped create. Perhaps the ultimate danger of NATO isn't malice, but its own unshakable belief in its own goodness. Its immense power and its ideology have created a dynamic where it sees itself as the world's indispensable protector. This is a conviction that has led it to bypass international law, topple regimes, and pursue policies that, however well-intentioned, have provoked predictable and violent reactions. And its story is a cautionary tale of how institutions created for peace can become instruments of conflict, and how the road to war is so often paved with good intentions. This history is complex and controversial, so what are your thoughts? Do you see NATO as a protector or a provocateur? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're finding this investigation valuable, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss our future deep dives. I've been Josh, this is The Villainous Vault.